All at once I clapped my hands and whooped for joy. I did not need a crystal clear view of the object to recognize it as the very chunk of land that had broken off of Ottoborg's world and brought me to this miserable place. At once I realized what was happening. The chunk of land was caught in the circular orbit, and the blue gas must be going in a straight line that took it through 2 points in that circle. I cried out, "For sure I am the luckiest of all of Ottoborg's sons!" Carefully as it passed through the cloud of blue gas, I jumped off the springy surface of debris and onto my chunk of my father's world. I have not been on the chunk of land for about 3 minutes, long enough to make this latest entry into my journal. Gee, it's great to be back home again. I hope I never... Here the excerpt of the diary ends abruptly. It is said that the chunk of land that Allo Al was on suddenly smashed into a dirt clod that collided with it head on. Both the chunk and the clod were traveling at great speeds upon impact. Nothing was ever seen of Allo Al again. Creaker's chunk of land was the biggest, and it was full of lakes. There was actually more land covered by water than not. Creaker survived many centuries on the chunk, long enough to learn how to create and build giant replicas of spoons and butter knives, enormous buckets filled with oversized sesame seeds, and huge loaves of bread, among other things. Creaker used the soil of the dry land on his chunk as the material for his sculptures. Whenever he would get tired of looking at one of his colossal sculptures, he would just throw it into a lake. Each of the colossal sculptures displaced enormous amounts of water, covering up a little more dry land each time one was thrown into a lake. When he was not sculpting, Creaker would be out scrutinizing one of his previous sculptures. He was very critical of his work. He always concluded that the sculpture did not communicate the concept that was the impetus behind the work, or he saw a hair or a bug sticking out of the clay. In any case, he was always frustrated. None of his works seemed to express his vision just the right way. He could not quite put his finger on the problem, but his general feeling was that it had to do with the size of the sculpture. "If only it was a little bit bigger," he would often say to himself. Then he would heave the thing into the nearest lake. His mind was focused intently on making each new sculpture larger than the previous one, whether it be a giant replica of a red pod bulb, or a mostly empty jar that had been sitting in the back of a valley for 8 weeks. Eventually, he spent very little time examining his finished works, but with an exclamation of disgust, he would throw the work into the nearest lake, which after a while seemed to be conveniently closer and closer, just as soon as it was done, and immediately start on the next one. The replicas were by this time so large that he had to climb them to work on the upper parts. The largest sculpture Creaker ever completed was of a baby's arm holding an apple. It was such a titanic work that he had to use spikes and ropes to get up it. When he finished, he had to rappel down the back of the arm. He backed up to get a good look, but could not back up very far since he was on a beach.